All right, having learned about the basic data types, understood why they are important, let's get started with coding the birthday countdown. Here I've just printed one line, welcome to the birthday countdown. Let's say now I want to ask my user to tell me when he or she was born in. So I can use the input command. We have seen this before. And I say, which year were you born, say born in? And I ask a question here. Now notice when I do this, this is like ask and wait in Scratch. So what happens really is that it says which year were you born in? And now it's expecting me to answer something. So probably I can say answer 2005 or whatever I want to. And that's all I have here. Now I would want this to go into a variable because I want to use this later on. So I go and say year is equal to, let's say, input, which year were you born? You can call it birth year, you can call it, player birth year or something like that. That's also fine. But any reasonable name will be okay for this, right? So now if I were to do this, let's say I will get, which year were you born in? I say 2006, and indeed that gets into the year. Now notice that right now when I'm asking a question, my user is expected to answer right after this question on the same line. But in fact, I can make this a little bit cleaner by giving the user a new line to answer this question. How do I do that? Well, we can make use of an escape character. Specifically, we can use this character called backslash n. We have seen this before. Backslash n gives us a new line. Be careful, however, where you're placing this. You must place this after the entire question. Otherwise, the question itself will get split. And still, it must be before this end of ending quotation. So it's like sort of just at the end of this question. And it has to be a backslash n, not forward slash n. Now, notice if I did this, because of this escape character, what will happen is that it prints this question, but it gives user a new line to answer. And that I think results in a cleaner interface. Now, let's say I say 2006. I know that this variable year contains 2006, but the question that comes up is what type of data are we looking at? So, well, we can look at year. If I print year, it tells me year, but year has two quotation marks, which makes me think that this is actually a string, which means the interpreter is looking at this as a sequence of characters. And I can indeed, confirm that by using the type command. If I say type year, I get exactly what I thought, which is class string. So str means string. Now, it turns out that we would want the year to be represented as an integer, and we have seen that this is important, right? Whether it's an integer or string, it matters. Good news is that we can convert this easily into an integer by just using an int command. Now, be careful again on where we are using this. We are going to say this entire, year, this entire question, I'm going to put this inside an int. So notice here I've got int small brackets this entire question and then another bracket. Now this time around what's going to happen is that if I were to run the same command, I will get asked this question. I will say, for example, 2000, let's say 2008 this time. Now the interesting bit is that if I look at year, now there are no quotes, because this has been converted into an integer, and I can also see this by clicking say type year, and that converts it into an integer. Now you might wonder why is it that we did need to convert this integer? That part will become clear as we go along. But you might also wonder what happens if my user gives an input which cannot be converted into a string. For example, let's say user is a little bit mischievous, wants to trouble you. So user says, okay, look, which year were you born in? I answer to say I answer 1988, but then I go and add some A B C D, say A B C D. Doesn't matter, something which makes it non-convertible to an integer. Well, our interpreter is not going to like this. Our interpreter is just going to throw his hands up and say that, sorry, look, this is an invalid input. I cannot convert this into an integer, which is reasonable, right? What happens also, let's say I run this whole thing again, and this time around, I'd say, okay, look, I'll still try to act a bit smart. I will give an year, which is not an integer. I mean, not like a number, but in fact, like a floating number, right? What would have been a floating number? Now, again, remember, integers are numbers without decimal place. Now here I'm giving something as a decimal place. Of course, this will be a string when I just take it in, but when I try to convert this to an integer, that will be a problem. And again, our interpreter will just give up and say, no, look, I can't do anything about this. Please answer to me correctly. Now, assume that the user enters correctly. So in that case, there'll be no issue. Of course, we can make this program robust enough to, kind of catch these errors, but that's some other time. So let's say, for example, say 2006. Now, this is a we gave 2006 earlier, so let's say I give 1977. This looks like a valid, reasonable input. When I do this, there's no problem, and year indeed becomes what I expected it to become. Now I can go ahead and ask more questions. For example, now I can ask, say month, and I ask, let's say int, again int because I want to convert that to integer. I say input, say which month, and now I must tell the user a little. I must help my user a little bit. So I just make it easy for the user. Say one for let's say Jan, say Jan, two for Feb, and so on. Yeah. Now, if I were to do this again, this question will appear, but I will, so I will just give my question mark over, let's say over here. And I want to also give it again a new line character. So again, I go and do \n. Now, please be careful on the location of this \n. That has to be within the string. In fact, I'll go ahead right now and ask myself one more question, ask my user one more question, which is that say int, say input, say which day of that month, right? So now if I were to do all this, then well, my program is going to ask me three questions this time around. Which year were you born in? I say, for example, 2009. Which month? Now I can say, for example, 2. Now I can also say, okay, so look, I've forgotten a \n here. That's why it just gives me, this number here. So I say, for example, 12, and which basically means 12th of February 2009. Now I can complete this by giving a \n. Now, before we move forward, I want to make a few points here. One is that you might wonder, why is it that my number, month was also entered as a number? Why did I not give, like, say Jan, Feb or something like that? In fact, I could have done that, in which case I will not need to convert this to an integer, right? Because I would like to see Jan as a name, Feb as a name, and so on and so forth. Those are strings. However, it turns out that later on I'm going to use this as a number, and that's why I've asked my user to give me a number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth until 12. The next question, which may kind of come to your mind right now, is that what happens if the user is very, very mischievous, and user in fact goes and tells me, okay, look, which year were you born in? User tells me I was born in 2099. Well, 2099 is yet to come, but user is mischievous. Now our program is going to accept that. User is even more mischievous. He says I was born in the month of 13. There is no 13th month. And which day on that month? User says I was born on 67th day. So user is being very naughty. He or she thinks he's being very smart, and our program right now is very innocent. It's going to accept all this because if you look at the values of this, it has taken year, it has taken month, it has taken day, everything as the user entered. Now you may think that the user is going to get away with this, but wait, we are going to do something very special to catch these kind of problems. Now, the thought that might come to your mind is, well, not a problem. I can say, okay, look, if year is more than 2022, then I'm not going to allow this. That's fine. Or if the month is not, say, between 0 and 12, 1 and 12, I'm not going to allow it. All of that is fine. But it turns out that we are going to use a pre-built module to do all of these things for us because in fact, if you think more about it, date computations are actually quite complicated. There are just too many rules. Thankfully for us, there is a module that we can use. We'll talk about that later. To wrap this up, right now, all we have done is to get users' inputs and convert them to integers. I hope this was clear. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.